Mersea Island lies on the east coast of the county of Essex and is situated between the estuaries of the River Blackwater and the River Colne, and is considered the centre of oyster culture in England. The island is renowned for sailing and boat building and has many moorings both wet and dry, and can provide all the requirements for today's leisure and professional sailor. Houseboats are common on the west of the island, providing accommodation for those who just like living on and around the sea. To the west of the island is a labyrinth of privately owned creeks that have been used for oyster cultivation for over 1,000 years. While to the east lies the public waters, for which fishermen have to have a government licence to fish, which has all the legal restrictions of quantity and size. Oyster fishing boomed on the island around 1830. There were approximately 500 dredging smacks and 2,000 men dredging from the Colne and Blackwater estuaries and also around the coast of Britain. About 1920 an oyster disease swept through Essex and Mersea Island, falsely blamed on TNT being dumped around the coast after the First World War. In 1930, the Portuguese oyster, also known as the port oyster, was introduced. This provided summer work in lean times, but this oyster is now almost extinct. Around 1965, things started to go terribly wrong in the Blackwater. Native oyster larvae was poor, and by 1980 had become almost extinct. Anti-fouling TBT was proven to be the cause. In 1982, oysters brought in from Cornwall introduced the disease bonamia to Essex. The days that followed, the older men gave up and oyster lanes were converted to yacht moorings. The younger men, however, were determined not to let the culture die and worked together to regenerate oyster culture on the island. Between them they purchased the major shares of the old Tollesbury and Mersea Native Oyster Company from McFisheries, who owned the oyster fishing rights in the Blackwater, with the hope of restoring oyster culture to the rivers Blackwater and Colne. By 1987 the Mersea oyster fishermen had begun again with new hope. The use of TBT had been banned and solent oysters were relaid in the creeks with success. There are two varieties of oyster around Mersea Island: the flat native oyster, only to be harvested and eaten when there is an R in the month, and the Pacific or Gags oyster, which can be harvested and eaten all year round. The oyster is a plankton eater. The native oyster filters 1 litre of water per hour and the Pacific oyster filters 3 to 5 litres per hour. As the water temperature increases during the summer, the oyster gets ready to spawn, and when the temperature reaches 17 to 18 degrees, the male fertilises the female, and after a week oyster larvae are injected into the water. During spawning, the native oyster releases approximately 1 to 1.5 million larvae. The Pacific oyster releases between 20 and 100 million larvae. Life of the swimming larvae is brief, about 8 days for the native oyster and up to twice that for the Pacific oyster. Towards the end of its life the larvae sinks to the seabed, but to survive it must find something clean to fix its foot to. Once it reaches 18 months it must be detached from the collector to which it was fixed to enable it to grow and make a nice shaped shell. The seabed is regularly dredged to enable the process of separating the growing oysters and to remove mature oysters. Oyster growth is very slow. These two are a year old, and these two 2 years old, and this one 3 years old. The native oyster needs 5 years, the Pacific oyster 3 years to grow to maturity. The oyster has many predators. This is boar sponge, which eats into the shell and kills the oyster. The starfish, which eats a hole in the top of the shell to extract and eat the oyster. And of course, the oyster catcher. Once the oyster reaches maturity, it is moved into the creeks to allow it to fatten, before being collected in readiness for the table. Much of the work in laying and harvesting oysters in the creek is carried out during low water. But before venturing onto the mud, it is necessary to put on this special footwear, known locally as splashers, to assist in walking around the soft mud. Once mature, the oysters are collected and stored in baskets in the creeks until they are required. Pre-1939, dredging under sail and haul towing was the normal method, but this was very labour intensive. This is an early dredge used for haul towing, much smaller than the current engine-powered dredges used today. Firstly, the dredge was thrown over the side, secured and left for a short while before having to be manually hauled back on board. The same manual oyster sorting process is carried out after dredging, just as it is today. The tradition of dredging by sail is revived annually, when there is a dredging match arranged between the old sailing smacks, a very popular event which is started by the Lord Mayors of Colchester and Mersea Island. Once the oysters have reached maturity, they are brought on shore and are first washed to remove all the silt and mud in this rather large rotary washing machine. The oysters are then graded on this rather unique machine, which is perhaps resemblance of a fairground roundabout. After grading, the oyster goes into this electronically controlled purification plant, where it is filtered with clean water for 48 hours before it is ready for sale on the restaurant table. Mersea oysters are packed and sent throughout the UK and Europe to hotels and restaurants. There are 2 fine restaurants on the island: the Company Shed, with its very special but unique style of dining, and the West Mersea Oyster Bar, where seafood can be eaten inside or out, weather permitting. And from both these restaurants, oysters and a wide selection of fish and seafood can be purchased for your table at home. What better way to start your favourite meal than with a plate of Mersea oysters?